Chinese population would still be aging toward retirement. 2 decades during which China won't have much internal consumption going on. 2 decades during which the low-cost, export-led model would still not work.
Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here. It is the 18th of January, and the news from earlier this week is that the Chinese have released a new batch of demographic data, and it is, in a word, atrocious. 2 big pieces of information. First of all, birth rates. In order to maintain your current population, a country needs a birth rate of roughly 2.1 children per woman. With the new data, China is now at 1.16, which is the lowest in their history and the second lowest in human history ever. That's on top of the fact that their biggest cities now have birth rates that are below 0.7, making it impossible for them to maintain their population at all unless they raid the countryside, and China has been raiding the countryside for the last 40 years, and there are now not a lot of people left to pull in. That means, just from this one statistic, China is already the fastest aging society in human history. The second big number is that China's population peaked last year, in fact, with the population dropping by about 800,000 people. The scary thing about both of these figures is that we know they're wrong. A couple years ago, the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces out of their 2020 decade census, and they came to the grudging and public admission that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of those missing millions having been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're talking about exclusively these 100 million people or so are people who would have been aged 40 or under, the folks who have the kids. You combine that with the birth rate information, and we are looking at the complete dissolution of the Chinese demography in a very short period of time. Because if you're losing a lot of people, or you've never had a lot of people under age 40, that suggests that the ability of the Chinese system to maintain a workforce and a tax base is dissolving before our eyes. And we've never seen a system anytime in history that's been able to make it through this sort of transition without a massive, massive, massive change in the political and economic environment. And the possible changes the Chinese are about to experience are not what I would consider things that will make this work better. The problem is that the Chinese model, economic model, is completely dependent upon globalization and internationalization. This is a country that imports 75 to 80% of their oil. This is the world's largest importer of food. This is a country whose oil comes primarily from the Persian Gulf, which is no longer being patrolled by anyone with a navy. And this is a country whose economic model is utterly dependent upon the ability to import raw materials and tech and then export semi-finished and finished goods to other markets that are in a different hemisphere for the most part, or at least a different continent. None of this works unless everyone gets along, and China has seen its economic and political relations with every single trading partner bottom out, with the exception, of course, with the Russians, because there's a shared love of genocide there. So a couple things. First, to a degree, we've always known that this was coming. In addition to the one-child policy, the Chinese have been the fastest urbanizing country in human history. And when you move off the farm and into the city, kids become a bit of a luxury good as opposed to free labor, so everyone has fewer of them. And the fact that urbanization happened at the same time as the one-child policy just crunched down the birth rate even more. We've now seen the birth rate officially, by the numbers that are probably over-optimistic, fall by more than 60% in just the last 6 years. And this is to a degree expected, because when the birth rate is low for long enough, eventually, 30, 40 years on, it cuts into the number of people who are having the children in the first place. So if you have a smaller generation with a much lower birth rate, you get a catastrophically lower birth rate, and that's exactly where we are right now, and this will not get better unless we figure out human cloning at scale. Second is the issue of timing. At the rate of degradation, there will have never been a country we already have never had a country in human history in this sort of situation, but we don't even have an economic theory for how an economy might function if this Chinese data continues on its current path for just another 8 years. So 2030 is probably the use-by date if it doesn't break sooner. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong in the Chinese system. Nothing with agriculture, nothing with trade, nothing with finance, nothing with the Americans, nothing with energy.
most industries and most subsectors that have decided to relocate to other countries have discovered that they've got shorter, simpler supply chains where there are a lot less of a political headache. Okay. Here is the new data. And as you can see that the number of children who are under age 5 has just collapsed. And there are now roughly twice as many that are age 15 as there are age 5. What happened back in 2017, well before COVID, is that we had a sudden collapse in the birth rate, roughly 40% over the next 5 years among the Chinese, the ethnic Han population, and more than 50% among a lot of the minorities. And that is before COVID, which saw anecdotally the birth rate dropped considerably more, and before COVID, which probably raised the death rate considerably. We're never going to get good data on death rate, or at least not anytime soon, because the Chinese, when they did the reopening, they just stopped collecting the data on deaths and COVID and everything because they didn't want the world to know how many Chinese died, so they don't know. With this data, this snapshot in time, this is official state data, it's still probably not wildly accurate. We still have the Shanghai Academy of Sciences, which is like the kind of the biggest nerd group you've got in the country, saying that the country has overcounted their population under age 45 by over 100 million people in the aftermath of the one-child policy. And so really what we need to consider is that official data now at the very bottom, you need to play that up. And this last graphic kind of shows you our internal estimate of where that is. Now, this is not official. Those yellow bars probably don't exist, but that is not what the official data is saying. This is an extrapolation from what the Shanghai Academy of Sciences is saying. Anyway, some version of this is probably the truth, which means that China aged past the point of demographic no return over 20 years ago. And it wasn't just this year that India became the world's most populous country. That probably happened roughly a decade ago. And it wasn't in 2018 that the average Chinese aged past the average American. That was probably roughly in 2007 or 2008. So this is not a country that is in demographic decay. This is a country that is in the advanced stages of demographic collapse. And this is going to be the final decade that China can exist as a modern industrialized nation state, because it simply isn't going to have the people to even try. So for those of you who have business in China, you're becoming more and more aware of the political system. You're becoming aware that it's becoming illegal for foreigners to even access data that in most countries is publicly available. You now have on top of that to figure out that not only is the labor force never recovering and the labor costs you're having now are as low as they're ever going to be, consumption is as high as it's ever going to be. So even before you consider the political complications or issues with operating environment or energy access or geopolitical risks or reputational risks, the numbers just aren't there anymore. So you have to ask yourself why you're still there. Sunk cost of industrial plant? That's a reasonable answer. But it becomes less relevant with every passing year as everything else catches up.